We're going to start this podcast out basically as normal, showing out the Patreon page. So anybody that wants to can donate to it. It goes from $1 up to $100 per month. However generous you want to be. Goes to help me to put money into my podcast and live streams, as well as helps me make my own living, being that I am on disability. Now this one is going to be a little bit interesting of a topic. As you see, that the title is on the Bryce Harper contract. We're just going to look on the economic point of view, because looking at it elsewise, you're going to find plenty of people talking about every topic and their mother-in-law on that. You're going to see 50 million people talking about that from every aspect you could possibly believe on for sports. Now we're not going to go in that aspect because frankly we don't really need to go in that aspect when it comes down to that. Most people are going to ignore the economic aspect because frankly everybody's going to say things and not even understand when it comes down to the money and what it actually means. They're basically going to say, well, hey, this guy got this money and this guy got this money and this guy worth this money and is that guy worth that money. Frankly, with this is you can you'll find people that do the sabermetrics and know a lot more about the actual money that actually goes into it and can actually break down the dollars per each of the war points that actually can be a lot more accurate to show if a guy is actually worth that money and to see who's actually the best value. Now certain guys are going to be worth a lot more, and you'll see how much you're actually paying per point, and that actually becomes a lot more of a valuable thing that you're going into, and that's something that needs to be understood. Now when it comes down to this is we're only going to be judging on the actual topic of the economics. I know I just had a viewer and lost them, but the fact is we're not going to be talking on the totally pointless view of oh, he's going to talk about what the he's not going to talk about these stats and all these other points of different things. But that's the whole point, is I'm not going to break down all these stats, and it's totally pointless. Now what it comes out to be is, what does the contract actually mean? Now we need to understand that most likely the Phillies are not set to win currently. So what we need to view is, what does this contract mean? Well, on a bulk sense, the contract means about $25.38 million for an outfielder. When it comes down to that, that's basically a person who is getting quite a bit of money, but it's still not as much money as what's been on other contracts if you start looking at the other contracts out there. When it comes out to his value, he tends to be streaky when we start to look at his actual abilities, but he can actually show that once you start to add things to your team, it starts to actually help. Are the Phillies right there when it comes to being necessary for a winning team right now? I don't think they're actually there. I think there's a lot of other teams out there who are a lot better equipped to actually win, which would be where we get to the actual structure of how we set up the actual contract. And I think when we start to get to the actual arrangement of the contract, gets to be other issues. And why did he do this contract? Well, I think he was really looking to have more of the big news of the highest paid contract in sports to date, of the actual money for at least American sports. And I think that's what we were talking about here, and that's what the issue needed to be known as. And I think that this has already been stated before. So what we get is, even though it's not the highest value per year, it's still, and people have already passed this in previous years, and even as far as even like a decade ago, values per year have actually been higher. What we have is an actual person who is actually earning a lot more. Stuff on the deal is no opt-outs, which is actually kind of odd that we're talking that he's locked into this deal, and a full no trade clause, which means that it would be that it's likely that there's going to be not even distribution, but probably an uneven distribution of money to actually accommodate for that no trade clause to make it worthwhile. And with that no opt-outs, it means that basically that he's locked in. It's not as much that they're locked in, it's more that he's locked in to this deal. And so when we look at what could potentially happen is, I think we're looking at something where we talk about it being front-loaded, a heavily front-loaded deal, then some middle years that are around the actual value of that, within that 25 million, but it could be a little bit less than that, that 25.38 million, and then something at the end which is an excessively low value, which will make that idea of him being either traded or dumped at the end of the contract very, very easy. Such as if his output does diminish, and this is something that needs to be understood. Such as, I think it would not be out of the question to see him start the contract because they're not there anywhere close to being a potential contender, being at the first 4 years of the contract at about 45 million per year. We see pitchers that have pitched around 30 million a year, and that's not out of the question. So being about 1.5 times that amount, and front loading that for about the first 4 years would not be out of the question. That would take 180 million off the contract, which would reduce that down to only owing about 150 for about the next 9 seasons. You take the next 6 seasons and you're doing about 24 million, which would be about 1.38 million below the average, which would put him around the average, and that takes another 144 million off that deal. Now that puts him 9 years into his deal, puts him approximately in his mid-30s, and then when you're talking about that, when you could possibly suffer some serious decline in his output, we're talking the last 3 years you're only going to have about 6 million left, and that's about 2 million per year. So if they had to buy out that contract to get him dumped and either waive him or potentially try to get him to waive his no trade clause, at worst they would be paying $6 million. And even if we're talking that contracts do not move, as thus we've seen a lot of times contracts have stayed pretty stationary over the last several years or even close to a decade for high-end players, we could see that something like that would essentially be very, very valuable to a team if they put something like that, something pulling that much away, because at most they would be spending $6 million, and that wouldn't even have to be, especially if you waived his trade clause at worst, or if they didn't waive the trade clause, that essentially could be divvied up amongst those 3 years, and that's $2 million a year for this player, a fraction of what would actually be owed. So thus it would be basically a player that they could do this investment that was divvied up amongst those years. Economically, when it comes to the actual city, is they even at that even if we're talking, if we front load it, it's going to bring a lot of it'll bring a lot of excitement for the first few years automatically. This is why we can expect a lot of front loading on these contracts to be smart, because when you start to bring a top free agent in there, this often the output of it is going to be that people are going to be very, very interested and likely to think that the Phillies are going to be some type of contender, regardless if they actually have the team around it. This is usually what happens with the fans. The fans will act irrationally even without this, which generates a lot of wealth for the actual area. And this is something that's going to be very, very interesting for the actual team itself, regardless of what the actual outcome is. You could essentially just have one player, and it tends to do things such as, like when you build a new stadium, the first year with it generates a lot of new fans coming in the very same way. And it doesn't matter if you have a winning team or not. When you start bring in one big player, regardless if it's the only player you have, it can sometimes generate, if it's one of the elite players out there, it can generate a lot of interest. And you can do this with it, especially if you front load that contract, and then if you look to build around them at a later date, you can essentially do this. And this is, I think, what their plan is, to essentially build around him at a later date, because they don't necessarily believe that they have the key points around him at this time. And they view that he wanted essentially excessively long contracts, so they figure that he's going to want that at a later point. And this is where we get to on the aspects of this economics of this point. Now, would there have been better fits out there for the team on a long term? Potentially, if you were building, but I think they're looking for that economic boom type of player. Not as much the player that's going to be that one that's going to be an impactful player. Now, the impactful player is going to be one that's going to be less of a economic boom type of player for your team. Now, Bryce Harper is going to be a lot more an impactful boom for your city. Going to be more impactful boom for your city, but less of an actual boost for your actual team. When it comes to the actual wins that he's going to develop for your team, it's not going to be as many as people actually think of, because he is very, very streaky, and he can actually cause your team to go up and down because of his inability to hit breaking pitches, and this is a major and other issues such as that. So when we look at him, he can be very, very problematic. He's not going to be as smart of a signing as when we look at the case of such as cases of Daniel Murphy of the Rockies. I mean, that's a much better signing, because when we see that that signing, he can be very, very impactful with teams and cause them to actually go on to win streaks because of what he does. Now, that's a different type of player. Yes, he is older, but that's a different case, and he's a lot more economical of a player. And that's where you find different cases. Now, Harper's not going to give that, but he's a lot more expensive. But if we look at Daniel Murphy, he's not going to generate anywhere close to the economic impact of a Bryce Harper for a region. I think when it comes to Philadelphia, they definitely need something that's going to be impactful for the region, because they have not had any type of real type of title type of player on that team that's really been key since they were kind of known with having Chase Utley and Ryan Howard on their team, and that being kind of their cornerstone, and that was quite a while ago when they were at their prime, and it's been quite some time since they've had that. And since they had Cole Hamels pitching for them, and since Cole Hamels isn't there anymore, he's with the Cubs right now. You're talking they're not exactly in the best position when it comes. They weren't exactly in the best position when it comes down to that. They don't exactly have the real big boom type of players that look like they're going to generate a lot of fan interest. So thus they wanted a guy that was going to do that. This is where you get the case of Bryce Harper. Pay him what he wants. Front load contract. You do something such as a front load contract, and I think that's where you get to something which is essentially a brilliant idea. And that's why we get the case of Bryce Harper doing that. He wasn't necessarily looking for the most money per year. He was looking for this horribly length contract that was going to give him the most money overall, which from the economic standpoint of whoever his agent is, the agent must be basically doing backflips, because frankly the agent is set for a long time, because that agent knows that he's going to get a steady check for the next 13 years. It doesn't matter what way it is with it. Even if they front load the contract the way it is with it, you're going to have the each of the years is just going to be a great contract of each year, and he knows that no matter what's going to happen, he's got a contract each of those years, and for the next 13 years he's pretty much set. Even at those small values, even if they front load it in the way that I stated, that's he's going to have it all throughout, because we can guarantee you they're not going to average it out with those amounts, because they just don't do that, because they teams understand the actual reduction in output. This is just logical. It's not logical for teams to economically look from the aspect and say, you know, we're gonna evenly distribute this throughout the career, because they understand that they get the most output on the front end, and it starts to deteriorate on the back end, because players lose bat speed, and they start losing physical abilities with their bodies. Their bodies start to deteriorate, and they're not as fast, they're not as nimble, they just don't have the output. It doesn't matter which player we're talking about in history. You can start looking at stats of some of the oldest players in the game that have actually been considered legendary, going back to like Babe Ruth. You look at some of his stats in the last couple of years, and you're going to find they're actually quite bad. And next to what you would expect his stats to be, and you'll see basically like numbers that were actually at least like 100 points low, 100 points difference in batting average, and that was what you would find at the end of his career. And there'd be equal, close to 100 points different in batting average, and that's could be shocking for some people. And that's because you just at the end of your career, you just lose a lot of that ability, and that's just what ends up happening. So teams make these adjustments to these to the players' salaries to accommodate, and that's just basically how the economics of the game works. They understand that they're not going to get the same output, so they're not going to allow a contract to go through that's going to be evenly distributed, and that's where the economics of that goes through. You're never going to see that go through unless we're talking a player that's going to be a mid-level or lower level, or a contract that's much shorter. A contract that's basically 5 years or less, you might see it evenly distributed amongst those 5 years, and that's a different story, because they know that it's very likely that they're going to get good quality output. But a contract that's like that's like 7 years or 10 years or God forbid 13 years, you know you're not going to get the same output as that. But a 5-year, like a 5-year contract of a guy that's working up from being like 19, 20 years old and working up to being a starter, it's going to be completely different. And that's a lot different than what you're going to find here. This is a lengthy contract to a guy who's already established, so you know that you're starting at the middle area of prime, so you know you only can go downhill from there, and that's where they're basically focusing on. They're looking on basically front loading that contract to basically get rid of all of that, as much of the money as they can, so they basically can take off that money from the back end, make the middle part of the contract be the close to average. And this is how they function for these deals. They know they do not want that money sitting there on the back end, because it makes guys unmovable when the guy waives his no trade clause, because otherwise you're basically going to have to eat that money. And teams, and especially teams that held on to these players, they know they don't want to eat that kind of money. You don't want to have to say, you know what, I'll eat $10 million on this contract. Well, you can't do that per year with it. Like, let's say if you have a guy with 2 years left on his contract, and you say, okay, this guy's making $25 million a year, you can't say, okay, we'll knock it down, we'll take $20 million off his contract, we'll send you $20 million over the next 2 years. That takes a lot of money off what you can spend that you could have spent on other guys, and that's very, very difficult. And you never want to be doing that, and that's why you don't do that for these players. You always want to think about what could you do for your actual team. What does this mean for your actual region as a team? Because when a guy gets near the end of his career, he becomes virtually useless, because he's only basically becomes holding your team back. And I know it's a hard thing to realize with it, because these are individuals, and they do have feelings about their career. They know that their career is coming to an end. They just don't want to admit it, and it's a hard subject to talk about. But what we're dealing with here is they need to understand that when you get to that point, is you can't be playing on a salary that's meant for guys that are virtually like 5, 6, 7, 8 years younger than you. And when the guy behind you is playing, is basically should be starting, and you're sitting there starting because your salary is so high that they can't move you, and they need to expose you because they need you traded, and you're sitting there with a no trade clause and all these other factors. It makes it very, very difficult. And then you have these other teams saying, well, you're going to have to take at least half his contract. You're going to have to take at least 3/4 of his contract before you can actually move this guy. And then the guy says, well, I have a no trade clause, I'm only going to go to these teams. Well, at that point, you're talking this guy's cannot really be moved to many teams because he has no value, and because he might be hitting 190, 3 homers, and like 12 driven in at the All-Star break with no steals, and because he has no more value left, because there's just nothing left there's not much left in the tank, and no teams really want to take a gamble on him anymore, without you basically taking off so much of that contract. This is why when we deal with these contracts from an economic standpoint, teams need to understand that if they're going to pick up a guy, it needs to be at a win-win for that team. They need to understand that if they ship you prospects, that the prospect could be a very good prospect, but they want to understand that that prospect is not going to be developed very, very quickly, number one. And number two is that they're not basically picking up a guy that's a very, very expensive player where they have to eat a lot of money and having to pay for it. And that's why we do these things with teams with basically front-loading contracts. They can make this average of this money of well over 25 million or 30 million a year, but they're going to have to front load the contract regardless if they want it or not, because that's the way things have to go, because you need to make sure that these are actually in the best interest of the team economically, because teams need to focus on the economics of the actual what's best for the team and what's best for the region, for the city, and what's best for everything. Now, there's certain things that will actually help out what's best for the region, for the city. A lot of times is maybe paying a guy more than he's actually worth at the start, because obviously a guy like, no player would be worth $45 million a year at the start. I mean, there's no guy that's ever played that would be worth that. And but the fact is it might be beneficial at the start to do this because it'll help you at the back end. And when you do this for the first few years, it might it'll free up a lot of money on the back end. Number one. Number two is when we look at the actual thing for the economic of the region, he might be beneficial for the region as well at the start, that it might actually pay off. So what the team actually pays at the start, they can actually pull out of what they would normally for putting into other prospects, and it would or other players on the team, and kind of back off what they would normally have tried to put for that winning team at the start. And instead of putting out an extra for free agents, they can kind of back off for a little bit, maybe develop a team, and then when you start getting maybe a couple of years into it, maybe get on that fourth year or fifth year, then you start getting into that real high-end team. And this is where you can really start kicking in high gear, and that's the whole point. And that's how you would build this team. Then you start getting into those average salaries that in this case would be about just shy of 1.4 million below the median salary of the contract, and that would go on for the majority of the length of the contract. And then when you get to near the end with it, when he's really reducing in output, it's basically, you could pretty much say, we're going to buy out the rest of your contract, and we can we want a list of teams you're willing to go to, and then we can trade you to whatever team you want to go to and set up this type of deal, because you no longer fit the mode of what the team wants to do. And they could pretty much set up these deals with it that would be beneficial, and to front load everything out. And they know that they basically just have to pay $2 million a year for the last 2 years, and they can pretty much set them out to whatever team they want on basically this essentially a 3-year deal, a 3-year $6 million deal. But the team that's paying him only has to pay essentially the 2 years, the rest of that 2-year million per 2 year for that 1 year, for that 1 year itself. The other 2 years would be essentially paid by the team itself, the Phillies, which would be beneficial for both sides, because the further down the road that he would be traded would be like, let's say if he's traded in spring training, it would basically average out to like $667,000 a year. And he could basically any later than that, and the average would keep going down further and further and further. And this becomes beneficial for both sides. They can go on to their next player for the position, whatever position he was at that time. Probably at that time would probably be left field, and he would then become a they would then cascade up another outfielder to that position. They would then be a young player to bring in, and they would move on. And it would be able to save them money. They could trade out for a prospect or a couple prospects and move along with their team. Economically, it would benefit both sides, because the other side would actually get a very, very good deal at that price, but they would get definitely an aging player. And this is where we get to the economics on the actual sport. And this is why we do it. Why teams tend to do these front-loaded contracts, regardless of what sport we're talking about: baseball, basketball, football, hockey, whatever we're talking about. Obviously, when we talk about when caps tend to come into it, there's a little more that goes into those front loads or back loads on the contract. Back loads usually only apply to when there's caps, though. And that's the issue on that. But when it comes down to this, is we're talking about front loads tend to make more sense. And this is basically, we're talking about the economics on the actual city. Now, the city is going to benefit on this, especially on a front load, because they're essentially going to lure in a lot more business from this move. And the move's going to essentially bring in a lot more interest when there wasn't really much interest in the city before, with its other things beyond it being the former capital of the U.S. and it being what I call one of the sports cities with it, but there wasn't really as much interest as they would normally have had. Because the fact is, as a baseball town, they have not really had much interest in a while because of kind of the downturn of the actual sports team itself. Now, when we look at, because of the aging stars who were starting to become very, very prima donna in that city, now when they start to bring in a big superstar like Bryce Harper, that's really going to bring in a lot more interest, and that's going to start bringing in business to the region when they've actually lost some business in the region before, over the years, from the economic impacts that have actually affected many cities from regulations and such. Now that this will actually start to build it right back up, and which is their hope, I assume. And they're hoping that basically that they can essentially build up the area, and it's going to be worth it for the addition of Bryce Harper, and that'll jumpstart the economics of Philadelphia itself. And the idea is to essentially make him worthwhile and make him essentially a title to the actual city, and they're going to make this a whole big deal, because he was viewed as pretty much the number one prospect out there, or number one free agent signing out there, I should say. Now, what's going to happen is there's a very high likelihood that's just like with any long-term signing, that this could blow up in their face, and it could end up becoming a deal like what the Rangers had with a guy like Prince Fielder, where it just never worked out, and it blew up right in front of their face. Is that a possibility with this, and where it doesn't work out at all and it just becomes a dud? Well, very likely, and that would not be unheard of, and I would not be the least bit surprised, because we're talking that he's going to a completely different stadium, and we don't know really how he's going to perform there on a full season. And we don't know how he's going to react with the different weather systems that are going to definitely be quite a bit different from what the actual coastline of Washington, D.C. is there. This is going to be a little bit inland, being Philadelphia. And the way the stadium's going to react is going to be a little bit different. Even though he does play there, being it's in the It's still in the East. We're also going to have to see how he deals with going back to Washington when he deals with the fans and they weren't happy that he left the actual stadium and signed with another team within the actual division. Now, he was getting offers from the Dodgers and the Giants, I believe, which would have been outside the actual division. He would have almost never seen Washington during the year, which would have been a completely different situation. But he opted in not signing with them because they were most likely not willing to give him the length of the years. Now, that might have turned out to be a completely different situation. But he wanted this largest total contract out there. And now this is going to play into the economics of the actual deal. How is this going to play overall on the length of it? What we're going to have to do is see how he actually performs in the first year. Now, this is going to see if it's actually going to be beneficial, even if they front load it, on how fans react on that second year. And when you start to front load more than 1 year of a contract is for salary, it's you need to make sure that player is producing. Even if the team's not producing, you need to make sure that player is producing stats on that first year, because otherwise you're going to be in a lot of trouble when it comes down to it, and they're going to be questioning the actual signing. Even if they don't question, even if they have trouble with the team, they'll still not question the signing if the player is actually performing well. So he's going to have to he would have to perform well within the range of what his stats have been in previous years. He cannot start performing at a level much lower, which means he can't do what other guys have done in the past and start performing where he's not hitting home runs, where the batting average drops, and start producing like that, because people are going to want to skin him alive pretty much. Because if he did that one, then you're talking fans are going to be livid, and it's going to cause negative economic impact to the region, because people are going to almost lead to wanting to boycott and have essentially an inverse reaction to what they were initially expecting. And this is where stats can play into this idea of what the actual economics to the region are and economics to the team. Because when you start signing the contract, they need to make sure that it was economically beneficial to them. And that boils down to, what do the stats mean to the actual reaction of the fans? The fans usually aren't concerned with the actual sabermetrics. With a guy like Bryce Harper, they want to at least see him healthy and on the field, and they want to see at least 30 home runs, and they want to see at least 90 RBIs. If they don't see that, they're going to be mad. They're not going to be as concerned about the steals or anything like that. They're not going to be as concerned about the batting average, because they've seen his batting average drip below. They're basically looking for numbers very, very similar to guys like Adam Dunn. So as long as he's pretty much doing the like former player Adam Dunn, doing that type of thing, they're pretty much going to be happy. But if he doesn't do that, and he tends to put up weak numbers, and he's putting up numbers that are below 20 home runs, RBI totals below 80, they're probably going to be quite miffed. And they're going to be like, what's going on here? And they're going to start screaming. And that's going to economically impact the region, because the worst thing you could possibly have with this thing economically for the region and economically for the team is if fans start boycotting because they feel that the Bryce Harper contract signing was stupid. and economically a bad signing. Now, if they do that very, very quickly within the first couple of years, that will become a very, very bad deal. Because frankly, with these, with the ability of that no trade clause, they're going to have a very, very hard time moving him. And especially with bad stats, they're going to have a very, very hard time moving him. That's where the problem's going to exist. Because if he starts putting up bad stats, has a no trade clause, has all this money sitting behind him, and if you have a front-loaded contract when he's not performing, you're in some serious trouble. Even if you have a couple years left on a front-loaded contract, and then it goes to a normal rate. Well, if he's not performing at all, and you're getting bad performance, you're talking no one's going to want to sign him even at that regular performance level of within that 24 million mark. They're not going to want to even sign him at that level, because if the performance is weak, they're going to say he's not even worth that. He's worth basically maybe 10 to 15 million, and they're going to say maybe not even that, and they're going to say he's a huge liability. And that would be a huge problem for teams. And then seeing the no trade clause, and he's going to say, I'm not going anywhere unless I specify which teams I'm being traded to, which can lead to a long process, and they could these teams then could have the upper hand in any debates of where to trade him to, which makes any type of voluntary exchange between one team and another very difficult, because you have this third party that basically can rule out any of these other teams. It's not even basically where he's created a list at this point. He can basically nix any trade at any time at this point. He's pretty much can kill any trade that he wants. And he has not even made a list of teams at this point. He basically can say, nope, not gonna do it. He basically can say, I'm not going to accept any trade to any team, which can kill any type of value of his completely. And this can be very, very difficult. It's not even like a partial no trade clause where you create an actual list of teams. He's basically created a full no trade clause where you're basically saying, I have full final say on if I'm going to be traded or not, and where I'm going to be traded to. So it basically makes him as a third party in each of these deals, which makes it very difficult for the actual ability to trade him. And that is something very, very difficult when dealing with someone that you really want to engage to trade, and when they're actually not putting up the abilities. And frankly, you're not going to be able to trade him until after any type of front loading would be done, assuming that there's front loading. And I assume that there would be, because they've only essentially at this point announced a deal verbally. And I think they're not going to do anything other than front loading, because it doesn't make any sense to do anything other than that. The idea to actually do a backloading would be the worst possible idea, because it makes his value totally illegitimate, and he would not even have any value on the market. If he requested a backloading, no team would have signed him, because the idea of backloading on a contract is basically brainless, and nobody wants to sign a guy that basically says, I want my contract backloaded, because they know that if you have to essentially sign a guy, you pretty much are stuck with that guy in that contract, and if he's put in no trade clause and no opt-out, it means you're kind of SOL on that contract. And that's the whole point. Now, when we look at the economics of that, when you have these things, this means that he's essentially making it to where he is this roadblock to any type of deal. This is why we don't want these type of things in these deals, and we should not have them. We should essentially have it to where if they wanted to create some type of no trade clause, fine, but they should essentially establish a list. If they want to reestablish a list before each season, that's fine, and they can essentially write it into the contract at that point. And I fully agree with them being able to do that because teams change after each year. And I would fully agree with that. But the fact is, they should not be able to essentially create a roadblock for the team to essentially dump assets. And that's essentially what a no trade clause does. And if they want to create, and it's fine if they want to do the no opt-out, because the no opt-out is essentially a two-way voluntary agreement, because it says the player can't opt out and the team can't opt out. This means that the team is going to be forbidden from opting out just as much as the player can. The player can't say, "Well, hey, I want more money now that XYZ players asking for more money," so they can't do that now because there's no opt-out. And that's why we do this, and that's why a no opt-out clause means that it's on two sides, so it is a voluntary agreement. But the idea of a general no trade clause isn't, and that's why we need to differentiate between the two. But a no trade clause that's established where you say, these are a list of teams that I don't want to be traded to, and if you want to establish them before if you want to say, I want to create a list of, let's say, 10 teams. You're going to make a list of 10 teams I don't want to be traded to, basically a third of the league. You're going to basically make a list of a third of the league that you don't want to be traded to each year. And you're going to start each year. You're going to make you're going to reestablish your list of what those 10 teams are, and you can readjust the list or you can leave the list the same. And players would be allowed to do that with it. But the idea of a generic no trade clause that allows you to essentially step in and stop a trade should be made completely illegitimate, because essentially you're not allowing a business owner to act in his own self-interest, and that's where the whole problem exists. And that's why we look at these things on an economic point of view. Though I think that's when we're talking about with the signings of these things, though I think this could actually be stopped if we talk about the ability of negotiations from these union contracts, number one, and number two, when we look at the idea of negotiating with these players. I think if no team was willing to give in and start paying these players and giving into their deals, I think we would say that, okay, we can get to that point and have a lot more voluntary contracts between the two and allow these teams to essentially have these points. Because the fact is when we have that to where the players essentially above the actual owners of the team, that becomes very, very destructive to the league, because essentially they are an independent employee of the team, and really nothing more. And they need people need to understand that, and because they can essentially live anywhere, because essentially it is a traveling job, and that's what needs to be understood. It's not like you're stationary with a job and somebody just trades you all the way across the country and you're all of a sudden you're working somewhere else across the globe. This is something where you're naturally traveling on a natural basis. This is not something like that. This is not like, hey, you're working at a factory in New York one day and then all of a sudden your boss decides, hey, I'm trading you to this company, so you're working at a factory in Colorado Springs, Colorado. That's not how this works. This is basically where you're traveling naturally. So you might be in for a few days in a row, you might be in Chicago. The next few days, you might be in Cincinnati. You might be out in Milwaukee. You might be in St. Louis the next few days, and then you might be on a home stretch for a while with it. But your home's going to change. But the fact is you could, most of these people, a lot of times they'll live in different locations, even if they're playing for a home team in different cities. A lot of times they will not live in the actual area where their home team is. Most times they won't. Sometimes they might take in a little apartment in there with it, but that's not where they're actually living. They will not usually live there when it comes down to that. I mean, take for instance the starting third baseman for the Cubs. We're talking he lives actually in Las Vegas, when we're talking his team is actually in Chicago. I mean, that is a huge difference. He's closer to the spring training facility than he is actually to his home team. When we're talking about that, there's the closest teams are like are actually out in the West, like the Dodgers and the Dodgers, the Angels, the Padres. So we're talking, the Cubs are nowhere nearby when it comes down to we're talking with the proximity for for Chris Bryant. I mean, he's nowhere near the actual team itself. He might keep a apartment nearby, but during the season, but he lives out in the Vegas area. And this is what happens with it. So the idea, that's where another idea needs to be discussed, is that the economics need to be discussed on the impact of these no trade clauses, because that is one perk that impacts the deal itself. And when it comes out to being what these contracts could be beneficial for the actual region is obviously guy they could stay there a long time with it. So obviously the length of time that could benefit, but it's could benefit the actual region, but it only becomes beneficial when the actual player is productive. So it's all based on the productivity. And this only becomes beneficial if Bryce Harper is going to be productive for that actual team. So if the Phillies if he's going to be productive for the Phillies, it doesn't matter if they're front loading the contract now and then starting to reduce the amount. If he's going to be productive, then it's going to be beneficial to him. Regardless if they're making playoffs or not, it's going to be from an economic standpoint. Now, if he doesn't become productive, this is going to be considered a bust and become one of those Danny Jackson signings like the Cubs had in the early 90s, where it looked like they were going to get some guy that was essentially a stellar pitcher and turned out to be essentially a bust that ended up blowing up right in front of their faces. And that's what you need to realize with it, is this is something that they need to realize of what they're getting. They could end up getting a guy who's essentially a bust and spending a lot of money on him. Now, okay, it's not the most per season, but economically this is still a risk, because you're getting a guy who's basically going from one stadium to the next. And when we look at Bryce Harper is we could probably go with looking at his at these splits for career for against the Phillies, with it just against like Citizens Ballpark, which is actually pretty good for his OPS, which is basically the stat you want to really measure. But it's actually a little bit better than what he's actually currently at, which is actually, so it would be considered a beneficial thing. But we're talking that batting average does go down, on base percentage goes down, but slugging does go up. So he does hit better for power, but he's going to have to keep those power numbers up to make those fans happy. Essentially, for 600 plate appearances, he would essentially hit about 268, about 52 homers, about 96 driven in, and about 15 steals, which would be beneficial for someone like him. And essentially, if he keeps that up with his during the next few years, it would be a good thing for him. But does he do that with it? Because if he hits any snags, the people of Philadelphia are not exactly known to be very, very friendly. I mean, this isn't like Wrigley Field, like what we're talking, where they tend to give you a lot of second chances. This is Philadelphia we're talking about. Philadelphia, they aren't exactly known for their friendliness to their people out there. I mean, when we talk about the city of brotherly love, I think they're talking more about in a sarcastic meaning there, because they're quite harsh. I mean, we've seen them boo football draft pick, their actual own football draft picks. We've seen them boo their own football players even when they become successful, just because they didn't like them. We've seen them basically have certain what do you call it, if they don't reach this to the height of a certain spot for on baseball players. We've seen them be very, very harsh on them. Basically, it can sometimes be even more harsh of a place to play than even playing out in New York at Yankee Stadium, and that's for the home team. So when we're talking about that, that's not exactly a place that he has played in, or an environment that he's played in. He's played from the actual aspect of an actual away team. Now, he might get the same type of treatment as the home team, which is not something that I think he's going to be used to dealing with. And I think he's going to have to deal with that type of rough treatment, especially from a team that's not necessarily there yet to win, and they're going to essentially give him hell. And when it comes to the economics of the region, he needs to understand that you're going to be dealing with something, and he's going to be expected to develop a lot of economic treatment of the area, and there's going to be a lot of light shined on him, a lot more than there was on DC. When you have DC itself, everything really has more of where the lights are put on the political atmosphere. So it's not as, so the sports atmosphere is really kind of secondary in nature to everything political. And especially over the time that he's played there, he got to play with the benefits of the spotlight being on first Obama and then Trump. So when you have that, he got basically all of the lights taken off of him. So he got to play with a relatively dim light on himself out in the sports arena there. So it really wasn't where he really had a light on him. Even though this is the capital of the nation that he was playing in, he didn't have to deal with the problems associated with playing in a major city that you would normally do, because the fact is you had basically all the controversies under Obama, and then all of the stuff that's surrounding around Trump every single day. So when you're dealing with that, you don't have to deal with much coming around the sports arena, because the sports arena is going to become, everything can become secondary in nature, and everybody goes, they might go, hey, do you see what Bryce Harper did? They might go, no, but did you hear what Trump said? And then it becomes one of those things, and it becomes just blown out of proportion. So he didn't have to deal with those things at all, because it was so he became basically small fish in a big pond. Now he's basically big fish in a small pond out in Philadelphia, and everything's going to be focused on him. And we'll get to see what happens when all the focus is on him, and what does he do when he has nothing else to take all of the stress off of him, because every moment's going to be focused on him when it comes during baseball season. There's nothing else to take any of the notice off him. Politics are not going to be really focused as much in Philadelphia as much as they are in Washington, D.C. You're getting a little bit further away. Yes, it is still Philadelphia, which is still pretty close. But you're talking. It's not going to be as big of an area as for politics as Washington, D.C. is. Washington, D.C. is just the complete beltway of where everything tends to become this massive swamp of politics and hate and vitriol and just garbage. So he could essentially use that as deflection on a bad night, and he could go into playoffs and have these horrible nights and just look awful, and basically deflect all of that off, and nobody would give him blame. But when it comes down to this, is he could essentially he's going to have to deal with 100% of all of that, and economically is he's going to essentially be that guy to bring economic development to the region. So if there's any type of economic falters, they're not as much going to be blaming national things. There's a lot of it's going to be on, hey, this team brought Bryce Harper in there to draw interest. How come this isn't working? He's not playing well enough. He's not drawing this national interest to Philly. What's going on? And he's going to essentially be taking a lot of blame, and all the spotlight's going to be on him. And it's not going to be as much on the ownership group or the owners of the Phillies. It's going to be a lot on Bryce Harper himself, and he's never dealt with this because he had the benefit of being in Washington, D.C. Now, when we see some of these guys that have had success in D.C. and on the Nationals go away from the Nationals, we see it just doesn't work. They tend to falter and fail because they just can't take what happens when they have the limelight on them. And this might be another one of those cases, and he might be the biggest failure amongst all of them. And this is the case. This is going to be probably your biggest economic failure to date, because they just spent essentially the biggest contract yet, even though it's not per year, it's in total value, on a guy that's not going to give you the output that you expect. It's not going to be the output that you're looking for to give this economic boom to the region and to the team that you're hoping that's going to spurt, that's going to essentially boost them into what they need. And this is where we're talking about this, that even though he does have the numbers with it, how does he deal with the spotlight? Because he doesn't have the distractions of Washington, D.C. to help him out now. Now he has to do it himself. and he doesn't have much of the guys around him when he had at the Nationals. And when some of the guys that left the Nationals that were traded away from the Nationals, they were kind of key over the last few years. We see that he's or have actually left naturally. We see that his numbers have actually gone down when it comes to WAR, such as only producing a WAR of 1.8 last year, when usually your star players produce closer to 5, which is something that is a little bit troubling. But that's going into those guys for the WAR. So if we're talking with that, what we produce in money, he's going to have to produce a lot more than he produced last year. I know that's going into those guys who go into sabermetrics, but any of us can go into looking at that and understand who are the guys that actually produce, and realize he's definitely not up to the level of guys like Mike Trout and other ones of that level. And this has already been stated by others. And we can see that when we do this, when we put this, put him under this microscope of him not being able to escape like he could in Washington D.C. by having the politics of two presidents they were essentially criticized on a daily basis by either Obama for the controversies of the several different scandals or from Trump by the basically 90+% negative coverage. When you don't have that, when you don't have any of that, you're kind of stuck. You're stuck on your own, and you have to do it on your own. And he doesn't have any of that. I mean, when it comes to basically what's going on in Pennsylvania, he's not going to have any of these. He's going to basically have to be dealing with all of this stuff on his own, and he's basically the local state politics of Pennsylvania and of Philadelphia is not going to help him escape from what was going on, because these aren't equal to those national issues that tend to blow up the wire and tend to make sure that any type of news gets covered up for what mistakes that he would have done, and that other cities don't have the benefit of having. And that's why he's going to get the first little taste of what other players have had for their whole careers. And we get to see what he actually does under the microscope of a normal player. Does he actually fold, or does he succeed? Because most people are going to think, oh, Washington, D.C. is hard to play under, but it's really not, because you have that scope of you're not the main focus. You're this thing that's kind of also there with the whole system of politics, and politics reigns in Washington, D.C. There's kind of this sports is this other thing. The thing that's basically covered in D.C. is always politics. It's politics 24/7, 365. Sports is the other thing that's there, and that's what needs to be understood. So when you leave that area, you're going to have to be dealing with a lot of other things. And he's never left that area for sports, so we don't know what he's going to do, and this is the whole problem. And economically with it, he should be a boom initially in the first year, assuming that his stats stay within the realm of what they're expected to be. He's going to have to produce a lot more than what his stats have normally have been, but if he produces within his career average, he should be. It should help the economics of the region. But if he falters under the pressure, we don't know how long this is going to last, And then we have the issue of potential injuries. As you start to get older and get closer to that 30-year mark, and over 30 years, you're at the risk of more and more injuries, and this is where things can happen. We look at guys like Ken Griffey Jr. Ken Griffey Jr. started out looking great, and he ended up faltering and having a great number of injuries with Cincinnati. And we look at that and we can see that he essentially took what looked like he was going to be essentially potentially the greatest player ever, and turned out to be a very good player, but not anywhere close to what they thought he was going to be. And that's basically about it on this one. With it, because we were just focusing on the economics of it. I did go a little bit into some of the stats because that goes into how it plays into the economics and if it's a good deal. But I didn't want to go fully into that because other people are going to do that themselves. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share this on when this goes up on social media to your friends and everywhere publicly. Make sure to subscribe and make sure to share it so they subscribe, and make sure that you if you haven't but you want to, make sure that you become a patron and donate whatever you can. The information is going to be down below right here. Plus, it's over in the chat if you're in the chat, and it'll be put up in the videos under live streams. And I will I don't know if I'll share this with it. I might share it on Twitter for those who want to see it on Twitter for the link. But that'll come a little bit later. Bye, everyone.